statins had came out in 1987. This was 91, early 91. So he wrote out a prescription for statins. I went back in 9 months and I just handed him his paper script and I said, I didn't fill your script. He said, "You're going to die a fat ass." And I just fired him and walked out. I had 2 diabetics that I worked with that are no longer diabetic, and they both had been diabetics over 20 years. His endocrinologist called my office and was like, "What did you do?" I said, "Probably what you should have been doing." And he was like, "I'll go after your license." And I was like, "Go ahead." When I was 20, I weighed 313 pounds at my heaviest that I know of, because I refused to get on the scale after that. I went to a physician for my yearly checkup, got blood work, found my triglycerides were at least 1,000. Of course, statins had came out in 1987. This was 91, early 91. So he wrote out a prescription for statins, and being naive, 20, I said, "Well, how long do I take this?" I thought it was like an antibiotic and, 7 days. And he's like, "Forever." And I'm like, I'm not okay living out of a pill bottle. This is before the internet, so there was no World Wide Web. So I went to the local library and spent every evening researching old medical journals from like 1850 up to about 1910, which is, we all know, that's about when Western medicine got kind of hijacked from holistic, functional, and medical to just medicine. So at the time, I had some acne, I had anxiety, depression, OCD, which I still have a little OCD, but I like it. I think nurses need to have a little OCD. I had joint pain, I had inflammation, and my allergies and asthma were extremely bad. So those were the main things. And as I read, not only was being shown not to be afraid of real fat, not afraid to eat, red meats, avoiding, even in 1850, it talked about avoiding high concentrations of cane sugars, what they called it. In like 1900, some of them started talking about refined carbohydrates. So we were already refining stuff by that point, and they knew that it caused inflammation, which kind of made me mad because I thought they knew that all the way back then, and here we are this far away from that time frame, and we're still being told the same things in the medical circles and on TVs and stuff. My initial idea was I went home and I didn't throw it away, I should have, but I took it to a food pantry. Anything processed, anything white, so white sugar, pasta, rice, potatoes, gone. Just got rid of those. And then anything I made from scratch. So if I wanted to make bread, it was like sourdough bread. If I wanted to make, cookies, it was with, like wheat beans that I would mill down to make my own flour. And that did okay. I did do some vegetables because we have a large garden that we have vegetables from every year. But vegetables always kind of made my stomach hurt and caused me to have constipation, which is the opposite of what you're told will happen. They really didn't have a test at the time, which everybody gets now, the hemoglobin A1C, but they knew that having that high of triglycerides is more important, that it's more of a precursor to diabetes. I love to poke other people, but I hate to poke myself with needles. And I was like, nope, I will do whatever it takes. So he had warned me that the following year when I would come back, that I would be full-blown diabetic and need to be checking my blood sugars 4 times a day and probably start on insulin, even though I had never done any oral medication for it. And I said to him at the time, can't I just change what I put in my body? And he said to me, that has absolutely nothing to do with your body, which didn't make sense to me either, because I used to rebuild motors, like for cars, and I had rebuilt very high performance, motor and put in my car. And I was like, well, I have to run like Turbo Blue, which is jet fuel, in that car because you want to run the highest octane so you get the best performance. And I said, to me, it just seems to me that that's how it would be for our bodies, is you are what you eat, which in the 70s here in the United States, commercials always talked about that. You are what you eat, da, da, da. Wow, those are gone. The reason that he wanted to do the statin, other than the obvious of they get the kickbacks, which I know that because I've also worked in a medical office and I know that they do, but was because that's what he'd been taught. You take this, it'll get all your cholesterol numbers down. And at the time, like I said, I wasn't a nurse yet. I didn't really understand the importance of cholesterol, but I never picked it up. And I went back in 9 months after starting, cleaning everything out and being ketogenic. And I had lost 153 pounds, and my triglycerides were sitting at 33. Now they run anywhere between 33 and like 50 now, depending on my exercise, fasting stuff when I get my blood work done. And he was extremely happy with himself. When I came in, he was like patting himself on the back of how great this statin was. And I just handed him his paper script and I said, I didn't fill your script. And he said, you're going to die a fat ass. And I'm like, I just lost 153 pounds. I was like, I don't understand where you're coming from. And he was like, well, this is ridiculous. Basically like, I'm the authority. You should absolutely follow what I tell you to do. And I was like, no. And I just said, and he was probably 200 pounds at the time. And I just said, I'm going to lose another 200 today. And I just fired him and walked out. I never went back to him as a physician, but I did, fortunately for me, and maybe unfortunately for him, during the last part of my clinicals for my RN at a large university, working the cardiac floor, because that's always been my passion, is how the heart and lungs and kidneys and everything works. His name come across as having a 5-way bypass, and he was going to be my patient. And I was like, oh, so I believe in karma. And I was like, yes. So I get to take care of him. And we did have to ask his permission because I had fired him, but it had been like 9 years. He had no recall. He had no memory of it until the second day when we extubated him, pulled his pacemaker wires and chest tube and his catheter. Then I reminded him, I was like, I'm the one that you told me that I was going to die a fat ass. And he was like, I kind of remember that. And I was like, and here you are in here. They just had to bypass 5 places of arteries. You had pieces that look like chalk inside those arteries. Your cholesterol, I think his total cholesterol was like 125. It was very low. And I said, and you've been taking your own statin since when? And he said 87 or 88. And I said, and we're in 2007 and you just had a 5-way bypass. So how can you explain away that you don't eat meat, you don't eat fat? He didn't eat eggs at the time. I think he did some dairy, some cheese, but was mostly vegetarian. And you've taken this statin for all these years, and yet you still had to have a 5-way bypass. How do you explain that? And he was like, well, it's family history. And I'm like, my dad was gone at 42, all my cousins gone at 39 or 40. I said, I don't think you can blame that. And so we had some pretty good discussions over the next day and a half, and then never saw him again. And then my mom called me a couple of years later after that. I think it was just the end of 2010. And she said, hey, this doctor, he asked me for your phone number, and I knew better to give him yours, but I did get his phone number. So I called him. I made him wait a month because I thought all the times I was in his office at 8:00 for that first appointment, and he'd show up at 9:15 without having the excuse of other patients took longer, which you can understand, but the first appointment, And so I thought, okay, so I'm kind of I'll meet you where you're at kind of gal. And so he was surprised to hear from me. And I just said, well, he says, I thought you forgot about me. And I said, I felt that way several times being in your office. He was interested in going keto, which he did eventually do. I shared recipes with him and the mindset behind the ketogenic type eating. And at that point, I think he was over 500 pounds. And he's a tall guy. He's like 6'5", 6'6". But he got down to, he goes anywhere between 195 and 205. And he no longer takes a statin, but unfortunately, due to, the regulations that the hospitals and the standard of care puts out there, he still prescribes statins to his patients, even though he doesn't take, and he's no longer diabetic either. Yeah. I did what I would call clean keto for 26 years until about 2017. And that's when all the keto treats started coming out on the market. So like your Quest bars and different things that, said keto on it. And even though I knew to look at ingredients, I just was like, it says keto, I'm okay. And so for 2 years, I did a lot of those treats, which really destroyed my stomach. So then anything I would eat, whether it was broccoli, would bump my sugar up 250 points, just like a carb. If I was eating sugar, it did the same thing. And I was like, okay, this is not right. Something's not right. And I knew I was lactose intolerant, but I'd kind of just trudged through and made myself do it. And then I was sitting on the couch with my husband doing what everybody else does and looking through Facebook. Joe Rogan podcast popped up with Dr. Baker. And so I was like, who's this cat? I had no clue prior to that who he was. And so I just started watching that video and I thought, this makes sense because my father was, his family was born in Upper Illinois. He was Cherokee Indian, but his great grandparents, had to walk to Oklahoma. So he was raised in Oklahoma on a reservation. And I thought, yeah, I mean, if you look at any of their writings, any of their paintings, everything is them chasing an animal. You didn't see these big stalks of broccoli and stalks of stuff. You might have some berries, you might have the occasional nuts and stuff. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I just started thinking about my ancestors and know how they hunted for their food. They utilized the entire animal. I also am a deer hunter. I fish, turkey hunt, we do that stuff. And I always try to utilize the entire animal. I use every part of it that I possibly can. And so I guess it was kind of a getting back to your own self, your true, authentic person and your ancestors is kind of what led me to do it. And it was simple for me because at that point in my keto, I had destroyed my stomach with all of those fake sweeteners and maltodextrin that was in those keto treats that are anything but keto. So I wasn't able to eat hardly any vegetables, occasionally broccoli, asparagus, Brussels sprouts. And so that was about the only three things that I could eat. I do fermented cabbage and carrots just for stomach health. I do keep some of that in the fridge, and then fermented pickles. I could do that. I just thought, well, let's see if I can heal up the rest of what's going on, because at that point I was starting to get joint pain again. I was getting cystic acne. I was getting going through menopause at that point. So I was 49. I just was like, I'm going to do it. Me and my husband have only been married at that point, not very long, 3 years. So 3 years we'd been married, but we'd been together about 7 or 8. And we married later in life. He was 49 and I was 40 when we met. We both kind of already were set in our ways and do things the way we do, and we're okay with that. And we're not trying to change each other. So he eats more of what you would call, I don't know if you'd call it paleo, but he kind of eats with the seasons. And he's always done that. And that has always worked for him. He eats quite a bit of meat, quite a bit of fat, stuff like that. So it wasn't that hard. It was like, I'm going to cook the main meat for whatever the meal is. And then it was like, I'd make his sides, but he's picky on how he likes his sides. And so he was like, I'll just do that. And I was like, cool. So now I make the meat, or I set it out to have it thawed out if he's going to be home before me. And he makes his sides. And that's just how we've done for 6 years. I don't think he'll ever be carnivore, but he is real close to keto at this point. He still has the occasional like little cookies and stuff that you buy from the store, but he has read those ingredients and knows exactly what those things can do to him. He no longer eats Doritos because he read the back of that. And of course, we listened to Callie and Casey Means when they were first really talking about this stuff. And then RFK Jr. I've known about the food dyes causing a lot of issues like ADHD, because my son definitely had that. My daughter, I think she's on the spectrum, but has managed pretty well through diet. So I knew that. And so he does a little bit better, which that's okay. I'm like, you do you and I'll do me. And that's kind of how we've done. In 2019, it was the first week of February. So I just hit my 6-year carniversary. I just said, that's it, I'm doing it. And the very next day I started. The acne, because it was hormonal acne, because I was getting ready to go through menopause, That cleared up within a few weeks. Sleep improved, my gut improved probably the fastest of anything, and then no more constipation. Everything was normal. The anxiety and depression and a little bit less of the OCD, where it was a little bit more manageable, that took a little bit more time, a few months, but I was able to get off of medication, and I titrated myself off because I had been on medication for about 6 years for anxiety, depression. So that's kind of what led me to do that. But in the middle of being keto, I went to nursing school. So I had been keto about 11 years when I went to nursing school. So even though we're taught the standard American diet in nutrition, I knew that doesn't sound right, and I'd kind of try to, banter with the instructor of, we're turning these Bunsen burners up to blue flame in order to burn these K calories. What inside my body gets that hot? So how am I burning these calories, And of course I had no answer. And it was like, you just answer what's in the book on the test. And I'm like, okay. So that's basically what I did. And then once I got out of nursing school, I integrated the healthier idea approach and more Eastern type, holistic type thinking, learned a lot about herbs and different plants in our environments, depending on where you live, that you can use medicinally. So that's kind of how I got started. And I always fry up ribeye fat every single day. I fry that up real crispy and put like Redmond's real salt on it as my side. And she was like, well, I made you a cake. And I'm like, I haven't had cake in, 20 some years at this point. And I'm like, I said, everybody else can enjoy it if they want to. I said, that's fine. But I said, I'm more here for conversation and just being with family. So that was pretty rough. And I heard about it at Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff the following year, which was fine. But now they just know that, like, if we're going like to my daughters to do either of the holidays, that I'm going to bring like great big ribs or sirloin, ribeye, rib roast, any of that. I'm going to bring that. And sometimes if we're making all the meat, we'll do a turkey, stuff like that. But I don't partake in turkey, chicken, or pork because I have histamine reactions to those things. So I guess I'm what they call lion diet of carnivore, where I just eat ruminant meats. Yeah, everybody else has really been pretty okay with that. I've done several speaking engagements in my little area that I live in at churches with different groups of people. And right now, I think I have 7 or 8 from 2 months ago, that every one of them has lost over 30 pounds and they're healing all the issues they had, whether that be psoriasis, eczema, irritable bowel syndromes, things like that. So that's kind of what keeps me doing it, not only for myself, but going out and educating other people, is because you want to see people healthy. And I don't know if you've watched Dr. Ken Berry, but he always says that if you can fog a mirror, it's not too late. And so that's what I do with people. Weekly, every day I did something except for Sunday. And so I did that for several years. And then when I turned 50, I was like, I do not want to have to run that hard. I felt like my cortisol, I never had it tested, but I felt like I was having some cortisol and some adrenal fatigue. And part of that was because of menopause, because the adrenals will help try to take over and make some of those female hormones. And so I thought, I'm going to decrease my activity. So I do sprinting now 3 times a week. I have a rebounder that I do anytime I sprint, I will rebound that time. I do anywhere between 100 to 200 push-ups on those days. I do planks. I do functional stretching. I ground outside. I also have a grounding mat on my bed. I get off of social media, blue lights, everything about an hour before bed. So my sleep is amazing. And then I crochet. I make blankets. I make lap blankets for all of my clients. And so we stay in the home usually 3 to 4 weeks. So by the end, when it's their last day and they are graduating, I give them a blanket. But that is kind of my meditation. It really calms me down. I don't watch TV because I would probably break the TV, so I just try not to watch it. So if my husband has it on, I'm crocheting. As for fasting, I did some fasting when I was doing keto, but I really didn't have that in my mind about how important it was to have the electrolytes. So I actually passed out next to my bed. I got up, went to walk, and down I went, came right back, and was like, huh, and went out and put salt under my tongue. I don't know why I knew that, but it worked. And then at that point, I started doing more fasting, which is when I think I did my most healing. I did several 7-day water fasts with just salt. And then every day, I usually do either OMAD or I'll do a 48-hour fast several times. I don't always recommend a lot of fasting with women going through menopause because of, messing with their cortisol. But I found that for about 2 years, I just did 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day. That was enough. There are some people that have been in the ketogenic world for a long time who preach lower fat and high protein. And for some people that might work, but I know that many people that have worked with this person, I think was a nutritionist maybe to begin with, that we had to get them to like 80% fat, 20% protein, and then they started seeing improvements. So I think everybody's body, of course, is different, but I think women really need more of that fat. I think mostly because of the hormones. But that's kind of where I work with most people, is getting them up a little bit higher fat, because people will be like, oh yeah, I eat 70% fat. And then when we go over their food, I'm like, oh, that's about 30. That's not enough. And I've had people that thought they were fat adapted because they had been doing carnivore or keto for, a couple years, and they weren't. So I think fasting, for one, the benefits that I found was, for one, anything that you haven't worked through, you are going to work through it because it will come up during that time, because you're not cooking, you're not thinking about, well, you're thinking about food, but you're not eating food. And so all you have time to do is reflect and just listen to your own thoughts. So I do always warn people, like, if you have anything you haven't worked through, be prepared, get a journal, start writing stuff down. But the other thing I learned from the fasting I did was what true hunger actually is. Because so many times we are institutionalized that you eat 3 meals and you eat snacks and you eat at this time of the morning and this time at noon and this time in the evening. And I just, with that fasting, I learned, no, I will eat when I'm hungry. And if I don't have a true hunger cue, I'm not going to eat something just because. And just, I think working with people that are afraid to go to like the office party or the family event because they don't want to stand out, and have them make them something specific for either keto or whatever they're doing. And I'm like, then fast or eat before you go, just mingle. I wanted to be a nurse from the time I was 3. So it was always like trying to save the hurt animal, I tried to save a worm that was ran over. My personality is always, I want to try to help everybody. But once I went into the nursing field, you get faced with that reality that there are just people that are like, they're happy to be miserable. They're happy to be going to the doctor 3 times a month, and they're happy to stand in the pharmaceutical line because that's easier than having to change what their lifestyle is. I do find that they'll seek me out either by word of mouth or come across me, on YouTube or something, once they've had a sickness enough or enough pain or enough of an issue that it's like, oh, I need to do something about this. So that's when you kind of see just how much do they want. A lot of patients I work with after I'm no longer their nurse, and work with them privately just so that you don't have any issues. I had 2 diabetics that I worked with that are no longer diabetic, and they both had been diabetics over 20 years. One had been a diabetic for 25, prevented him from having to have more of an amputation. He had had one just below the knee and is a truck driver. So he wanted to be able to drive, which you can if you can get a prosthetic below the knee. But if it goes up above that joint, then you can't get a CDL. So I worked with him. He got off of 2 insulins, 3 oral glycemic medications, changed his diet. He also wore a CGM, which really helped him see how the foods were affecting him. And he went what I would call keto, because he still does do certain things. But like if he's going to have oatmeal, which he's not going to do every day, and he eats the whole oatmeal, so like the steel cut version, he puts butter with it because that fat slows down how fast those carbs convert. So he found that that kept him from having spikes. So worked very well. He was able to heal back to driving his truck. And it was after I was no longer seeing him as a patient, but his endocrinologist called my office and was like, "What did you do to," and, said his name. And I said, "Probably what you should have been doing." And he was like, "I'll go after your license." And I was like, "Go ahead. My nursing license and my scope of practice says education on nutrition. Doesn't say who gets to pick. It just says nutrition." And that's what I did. And I said, "What about this patient?" He didn't even realize that the other fella that he had, that I also had, was no longer seeing him, because here, Medicare will not pay for you to go to a specialty like diabetic doctor, cardiac, whatever it is, if you no longer have that diagnosis. And after 6 months, I think his hemoglobin A1C went down to 5.5, and now he sits at 5.1. And he's been there for almost 2 years now. So they had to remove that diabetes diagnosis, so he no longer could go there. I just told this endocrinologist, I said, "I don't think you're going to run out of money, because we've done ruined all these kids by giving them juice constantly and all the pop and all the food. You'll have plenty of diabetics to take care of in the future." So he hung up on me, which is okay. I'm fine with that. That was last year. I haven't heard back from him, but I welcome that if that's what they want to do, because I always stay within my scope. I did have one patient last year who was very young. He wasn't even 50, who had had like stroke from having too much plaque in his coronary arteries, but also in his carotids. He had open heart bypass at like 49, had 2 heart attacks within that time frame. And I can remember looking at his paperwork and just thinking, I'm not even going to discuss anything about nutrition at this point, because I knew he was on absolutely borrowed time. I just by looking, I knew. I get in there and it's like 20 minutes into getting him admitted, and I just scanned the kitchen, and it was like Honey Nut Cheerios and just Cocoa Crisp cookies that are for cereal in the morning. And I just was like, oh, I was like, okay. I was like, how about we try to work on this? And so we cleaned up his diet a little bit, but as I suspected, he only did survive about 2 months. He also had a cancer that they did not know about in his throat that you couldn't really see from the outside, but it was in the parotid glands. And so that spread. So I figure he got, a few months of eating a little bit better, and he loved steak. Why not? That's basically kind of how I try to educate people. I have kind of that captive audience with mine, because I'm in their home working with them and their family and their doctors kind of one-on-one. So it's a little bit easier than me just going out at the grocery store and telling people. I really don't say anything to other people when it comes to their carts of what's in there. I don't bring that up. I do read ingredients out loud, like I'll walk down the aisle. I live in what we would call a conservative area. It's a lot of farmers, so there's some liberal people, but a lot of conservatives. It's pretty easy for them to look at what is out there. So I show them, here's what the food pyramid said. And I'm like, just think about 11 servings of breads and cereals and rices a day, and you're diabetic. Does that even make sense? Because you know enough now, just from the news and TV, that these carbohydrates convert to sugar. So I kind of go through that with them. But Really, most of them, as long as you can explain it to where they can understand, and it may be different with every single person based on, how much knowledge they have and education, background, stuff like that. But really, I mean, pretty much everybody has cleaned up their diets, and some of them are similar to like my husband, where they just kind of eat with the seasons. Like if there isn't tomatoes growing in your backyard, you're not buying tomatoes at the store. If there are peaches on our trees, we have peach trees, you're not going and buying fruit. You're trying to do that. So that a lot of them do that. And I found probably the smartest age group of people I work with are in their 90s. So, and I have had several that are in their upper 90s and into their hundreds. Those people are the easiest for them to listen because they remember back when the food was natural. It wasn't sprayed constantly. It wasn't, genetically modified water. They did their own milk. It was raw milk. You didn't send it someplace to have it, pasteurized and homogenized. So they remember that. They remember their parents cooking and baking grease and lard and eating the fat that was with the meat. They remember that, eating single ingredient foods, knowing that like when they make their bread, 4 or 5 ingredients, and then, and I would show them. I'd grab the loaf of bread off the top of their fridge and I'd be like, 37 ingredients in this one loaf of bread. And it's just like, aha. And they got it. They understood. And so the very early 20s seem to be the next ones that are like, and I think it's because they went through the last, 4 years of corruption and saw that and thought, their schools were closed. They were forced to do things they didn't want to do, and saw like, this doesn't feel right, So I've been pretty fortunate that most of them take to it. I plan on doing it until my last breath, if I can possibly do that. Even if there was ever a reason for me to leave the nursing field, which potentially, if they did the same thing we went through before on a different level, I probably would leave the nursing field. I would still continue to do what I do. I would still continue to make all my products and stuff. So I would be fine. I was raised extremely poor. We didn't have a TV till I was 7, a car till I was 13. And so there's not much that they can take away that I'm like, that's okay. Go ahead. I don't have to have fancy, shiny things. So as long as I feel good, I feel healthy, and I'm helping other people, that's kind of like my mission. So as long as I can do that, I'm fine.